Trump just posted a public statement, a statement that a regime like Iran should never have been allowed to send. The original text: Iran has informed us that they are in a state of collapse. They want us to open the Strait of Hormuz as soon as possible as they try to figure out their leadership position, which I believe they will be able to do. Reading it once, this seems like a typical victory declaration. But read it carefully again, and you will see two things that no news outlet is talking about. First, Iran proactively informed its greatest enemy that it is collapsing, not forced to admit it, not exposed through intelligence, proactively informed. Second, right in that sentence, Trump reveals that Iran is in a leadership crisis. They are still trying to figure out their leadership position. And the most concerning part is not what is being said. It is why a regime like Iran has fallen into that situation. Because on the same day Trump posted that line, Iran's foreign minister was sitting on a plane to St. Petersburg to meet Vladimir Putin, Tehran's only remaining friend. The regime had spent years helping Russia with drones, missiles, engineers, and now when Iran needs it, Putin has nothing to give back. No navy to break the blockade, no economic leverage to replace Iran's trade, nothing that Iran really needs. A regime that calls itself invincible is now having to beg its only broke friend left. To understand why this has historical significance, you have to understand what the Islamic Republic of Iran was built on. For 45 years, this regime has operated on a single doctrine: self-reliance, resistance economy, never beg, especially from the enemy. It is not just propaganda, it is the foundation that legitimizes all of their power in front of the Iranian people. The reason the people accepted sanctions, accepted poverty, accepted isolation. When that doctrine collapses, what collapses along with it is not just the economy. So what is really happening inside Iran? Why is a regime that has survived decades of sanctions, proxy wars, and many bloody protests now shaking in this way? And why this time, different from 2009, different from 2019, different from 2022? The answer lies in three pressures tightening around Iran at the same time: an economic blockade that is strangling the regime's lifeline, internal chaos that is paralyzing decision-making ability, and diplomatic isolation that is closing off every escape route one by one. Each of those pressures on its own is dangerous enough, but all three at once create an equation that this regime has never had to face before. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you will understand exactly what is changing inside Iran, why it is happening, and why it is far more important than what is being reported. I am Ryan Mitchell. Let's begin. Let's start with what is really happening in the Gulf of Oman. If you look at satellite images taken in recent days, you will see something that has never appeared in those waters before. Dozens of white dots sitting still, lined up in long rows, not moving. Those are oil tankers. They have entered Iranian ports. They have been fully loaded with oil. They have passed through the Strait of Hormuz, but they cannot go anywhere anymore because on April 13, the U.S. Navy established a maritime blockade, and as of today, that blockade has stretched for more than 2 weeks, with not a single ship successfully breaking through. This is the first important thing you need to understand correctly, because there are many confusing reports spreading. The U.S. is not blocking at the Strait of Hormuz. The U.S. is blocking at the boundary between the Gulf of Oman and the Arabian Sea. That means ships can enter Iranian ports, can load up with oil, can pass through Hormuz, but when they reach the Gulf of Oman, they encounter the U.S. Navy and cannot proceed any further. Reports saying Iranian ships just passed Hormuz are not wrong, but they mean nothing. Passing Hormuz does not mean escaping the blockade. And one more technical detail: ships from third countries going to ports in Saudi Arabia, Iraq, or any other Gulf country are completely free. The blockade only targets ships entering or leaving Iranian ports. So when you see reports of ships passing Hormuz, ask immediately, where is that ship going? Kepler, the global research company that provides data to the world's largest oil corporations, has just released an estimate that Iran has about 12 to 22 days of oil reserves left. Such a wide range is not because Kepler lacks analytical capability, but because Iran is not transparent about its actual reserve levels. And Kepler confirms one thing more clearly: they have not observed any ship successfully breaking the blockade, not a single one. Now, Iran's National Security Council in an internal meeting has estimated that their economy cannot withstand more than 6 to 8 weeks of blockade. But this is what you must understand about that number. It is an estimate from the Iranian side, meaning the most optimistic number possible. When the people involved say they have 6 to 8 weeks, in reality it is very likely significantly less. So why is the economic blockade the real weapon in this war, instead of bombs or missiles? The answer lies in something analysts call the double whammy. The blockade not only stops oil exports, Iran's main source of revenue, it also stops imports, including food that Iran depends heavily on from external supplies. No revenue coming in, no food coming in, two blades tightening from both sides at the same time, and this is not by accident. Iran has become especially vulnerable to this type of attack, precisely because decades of previous sanctions have forced it to build an economy that depends almost entirely on crude oil exports, with no diversification, no large enough financial buffer to withstand a shock like this. But there is a deeper layer I want you to pay attention to. Bombs destroy infrastructure, and infrastructure can be rebuilt. An economic blockade destroys something that cannot be rebuilt, the regime's legitimacy in the eyes of its own people. When the Iranian people have no food, no income, no economic future, and they see their regime unable to do anything to change that, the question is no longer should we protest, but what else do we have to lose? Secretary of State Rubio has said, America has no interest in giving Iran a breathing room while they are suffering. This is not a blockade to create bargaining pressure. This is a deliberately calculated, intentional strangulation blockade, and it is working exactly as designed. But the economic blockade is only half of the picture, because while the U.S. Navy is tightening the noose at sea, the Iranian regime is tightening the noose on land with its own hands, and they are doing it to their own people. More than 60 days. That is how long Iran's internet has been completely shut down. We have passed the 2-month mark. 99.9% of Iran's population, more than 90 million people, cannot access the internet, cannot communicate with the outside world, cannot connect with each other, and the economic consequences of that decision are being recorded by Iran's own security agencies in internal reports. About 20% of the workforce, especially those working online, have effectively become unemployed. An additional 2 million people in the private sector are at direct risk of losing their jobs because of the internet shutdown. Iran's National Security Council has met to assess the situation, and the conclusion of the security agencies is not protests may occur. The conclusion is that protests are inevitable. The only question is when. They have identified 3 specific triggers: rising prices, escalating unemployment, and severe damage to the petrochemical and steel industries, the 2 most important industrial pillars of Iran's economy. Now, if you read those numbers and think that the Iranian regime is making a serious strategic mistake by shutting down the internet, you are looking at the problem wrong. This is not a mistake. This is a conscious choice. And to understand why they made that choice, you have to understand the survival logic of a regime that is being backed into a corner. The Iranian regime does not fear economic collapse the most. They fear the Iranian people being able to connect with each other the most. Why? Because economic collapse is a risk, dangerous, potentially prolonged, but still a risk the regime can try to manage. But the people organizing together is the end, not a risk, the end, and they know that because they have seen how close it came. In 2019, a wave of protests broke out over rising gas prices. The regime suppressed it violently, but maintained control. In 2022, the Woman Life Freedom movement spread across the country. The regime took many months to regain control, and the price was hundreds of people dead. Then, in January 2026, a wave of economic protests erupted, and this time, according to information from Iranian officials themselves, the regime was only a few days away from losing power. A few days. Each wave of protests got closer to the point of no control. And each time, the internet was the central organizing tool that allowed people to coordinate, share information, and maintain momentum. The regime has learned that lesson. And they have decided that even if it costs 2 million jobs, even if it costs 20% of the workforce, even if it means self-destroying another part of an already collapsing economy, they will not leave the internet in the hands of the people. But this is what makes the situation truly dangerous for the regime itself. not for America, not for outside countries, but for the very people issuing the orders to shut down the internet. The internet shutdown does not stop protests, it only delays them. And while it delays, every day that passes adds thousands more people losing income, more families without enough money to buy food, more workers in the petrochemical and steel industries receiving notices to stop work. The regime is racing against the very trap it created, and every day they continue running, that trap tightens another turn. What the Iranian regime truly fears is not American missiles, it is not the naval blockade. It is 90 million Iranians when they are able to connect with each other and with the outside world again. That is the only reason that explains why they are willing to sacrifice everything else they have left. While all of that is happening, Iran's foreign minister flew to St. Petersburg to meet Vladimir Putin. Russian state media released footage of the Iranian foreign minister landing, footage of the two sides meeting before entering a closed-door meeting that lasted 2 hours. And right before the meeting began, the Iranian side proactively announced Iranian diplomats did not come to Russia to ask for assistance. In international diplomacy, this is one of the clearest signals you can receive. When a delegation feels the need to declare before entering the meeting that they are not coming to ask for the only thing you can be sure they are coming to ask for. But before getting into what they are asking for, we need to understand what the Iran-Russia relationship really is. This is not an ideological alliance. This is not a friendship between two nations that share common values. This is a calculated transactional relationship, and Iran has paid upfront a great deal. When Putin launched the invasion of Ukraine, Iran stepped in and helped Russia significantly. Mass Shahed drones, ballistic missiles, and even Iranian engineers who went to Russia to build a Shahed production plant right on Russian soil. In return, Russia provided Iran with reconnaissance satellites that sweep over U.S. bases in the region, and just days after the Russian satellite flew over, Iran could program drones to strike those bases precisely, even civilian buildings. That is what Russia has been able to do for Iran. But now Iran is sinking, and they need something that Russia does not have the ability to provide. And this is the core problem of the second layer you need to understand. Russia actually cannot help Iran in this situation. Putin is bogged down in Ukraine, a war of attrition that he cannot withdraw from and cannot win quickly. This is a man who cannot even protect his own oil refineries from Ukrainian drones. Russia does not have a navy strong enough to challenge the U.S. Navy in the Gulf of Oman. Russia does not have sufficient economic leverage to replace the entire trade network that Iran is losing. And most importantly, Russia cannot do what Iran really needs right now: break the naval blockade. There is nothing in Putin's geopolitical arsenal that can reopen the oil export route for Iran. So why did Iran's foreign minister still fly to St. Petersburg? This is the third layer, and this is the layer that most commentators are missing. Pay attention to the timeline. Iran sent a peace proposal to the U.S. The U.S. rejected it immediately, and right after that, not days later, but right after that, Iran's foreign minister flew to Russia. That sequence is not random. It is a deliberately sent message. We have other options. We are not standing alone. In reality, this is the diplomacy of the weak, not negotiation from a position of strength, but buying time with the illusion of alliance. Iran needs the world, and more importantly, needs the Iranian people to believe that the regime still has allies, still has options, and has not been completely isolated. The meeting in St. Petersburg did not create any solution. The joint statement after the 2-hour closed-door meeting did not reveal anything substantive, not a single detail about what was actually discussed. But there is one detail about this meeting that you should not overlook. The head of Russia's security agency was present in the room. This was not a regular diplomatic meeting, and this has precedent. During the previous 12-day war, an Iranian delegation also went to Russia, and that meeting also involved security officials. That shows that at least part of the discussion was revolving around what Iran would do if the war reignited. But there is a fourth layer in this story, and this is the most important layer because it concerns not only the Iran-Russia relationship, but the entire ability of Iran to make any strategic decisions right now. When Putin ended the meeting, he said one sentence in front of the cameras: "Give my regards to the Supreme Leader for his message, not thank you for the call, not thank you for the video conference, but for his message, a letter." Mustafa Khamenei, The new supreme leader of Iran, up to this point, has not appeared publicly even once. He only communicates through letters, and this is something no one in the analyst community can overlook. Anyone can write a letter in someone else's name. The complete absence from public space, combined with communicating only through text, creates a power vacuum that no one outside Iran can fill with certainty. Recently, at an IRGC event in a major Iranian city, they hung a picture of Mustafa Khomeini on a martyr's memorial mural, those who died in this war. That was both a signal confirming he is still alive and created confusion because this was an IRGC event, a force that has its own interests in this power succession crisis. U.S. Secretary of State Rubio posed 3 specific questions, not as rhetorical questions, but as questions that Washington itself really does not have answers to. Does he have enough clerical credibility to lead? Is he actually making the decisions, or is someone behind him controlling 90% of everything in his place? And the bigger question, will hereditary succession of power be accepted within Iran's clerical system? This is the first time in the 45-year history of the Islamic Republic that the legitimacy of the head of state is being publicly questioned by the adversary. Not after the crisis ends, but right while the two sides are sitting down at the negotiating table. And when your adversary is not sure whether you even still have leadership, you cannot negotiate from any position of strength. So what is Iran doing with all of that pressure? They are negotiating, or at least they are trying to create the illusion of negotiating. Iran's first proposal sent to Washington was very simple in structure. Iran would reopen the Strait of Hormuz if the U.S. lifted the naval blockade. The U.S. rejected it immediately. And right after that, through Pakistan, a country now playing the role of intermediary, Iran announced that they were drafting a new proposal, expected to be sent in the coming days. Meanwhile, sources describe communication with senior Iranian leadership as difficult and slow. Let's pause on that detail for a moment, because it is more important than it appears. When a country is in a survival crisis, when the economy is collapsing, when protests are assessed as inevitable, and even in that situation, communication with their leadership remains difficult and slow, that is not a sign of a government that is in control of the situation. That is a sign of a power system that is paralyzed from within. Rubio, in his first interview since the ceasefire began, described Iran with a sentence I want you to remember. Other than the fact that the country is run by radical Shia clerics, that's a pretty big impediment. That was the tone of the entire interview, and it tells you exactly how Washington is looking at this negotiating table. Rubio described the internal divisions in Iran not in the usual way, not moderate factions facing hardliners. He said it straight. Everyone in Iran is a hardliner. But there are 2 different types of hardliners in nature. One type understands that they have to run a country and an economy, people who look at reality and understand that there are limits to what can be done. And one type is completely driven by theology, people for whom ideology is more important than consequences. When those 2 groups disagree with each other, and when the new supreme leader has not appeared publicly to arbitrate, you do not have a government that is negotiating. You have a collection of factions fighting for control, and that explains why communication is difficult and slow, why the first proposal was rejected immediately, and why the second proposal is being drafted, but no one knows what it will look like. But let's go back to the real strategic question. Why did the U.S. reject Iran's first proposal without even thinking? To understand that, you have to understand what that proposal really was. Iran proposed separating the 2 issues. Resolve Hormuz first, discuss nuclear later. On the surface, that seemed like a reasonable step forward. Address the most urgent problem first, build trust, then continue. But that is exactly why it was a strategic trap. If the U.S. agreed, Iran would lift the blockade, gain breathing space, begin economic recovery, stabilize internally. And then when the 2 sides sat down to discuss nuclear, Iran would no longer be negotiating from a position of collapse. They would negotiate from a recovered position, with more leverage, with less pressure, with more time to wait. Rubio understood that completely. He said it straight. The nuclear issue is the reason for this war from the beginning, not Hormuz, not the blockade, nuclear. And this is the argument Rubio made, an argument that I think deserves to be heard in full. Look at what Iran has done with what they already have. They built Hezbollah in Lebanon. They financed and armed Hamas. They maintain a network of militias in Iraq. They do not just want to protect Iran, they want to export their revolution. They want to dominate the entire region. And in this war, when backed into a corner, they attacked civilian ships in international waters. They attacked Qatar and Oman, two of their own traditional allies, because they saw this war as an existential threat to the regime. Rubio used a specific phrase to describe it. Iran carried out a terrorism rampage to survive, a terrorism campaign to survive. And they put up billboards in Tehran, openly, proudly, boasting that they could hold 20 to 25% of the world's energy hostage. Rubio called Hormuz an economic nuclear weapon, and his question, the question Washington is using to reject any proposal that separates Hormuz from nuclear is, if this is what Iran does when they only have conventional missiles and drones, then what happens when they have nuclear weapons? If there is no deal, Rubio warned clearly, more can be brought to bear. America still has many unused sanctions. This is not a vague diplomatic statement. This is a deliberate escalation signal made publicly so that Iran and everyone watching understands that the current pressure is not the upper limit. It is the starting point. Now let's step back and look at the big picture. There is one question being asked right now. Why is this time different? Iran has gone through crises before, many times. In 2009, the Green Movement wave poured into the streets of Tehran, and the regime suppressed it. In 2019, the gas price protests spread across the country, and the regime maintained control. In 2022, the Woman Life Freedom movement lasted for many months, and the regime still stood firm. In January 2026, the wave of economic protests pushed the regime to the brink, just a few days, and the regime still survived. So why is this time different? The answer is not that the pressure this time is greater. The answer is that this time all the pressure release valves have been closed at the same time, and that has never happened before. In every previous crisis, Iran always had at least one valve still open, the economic valve. Even under sanctions, Iran could still export oil illicitly through intermediaries, China, the UAE, secret shipping routes. That cash flow was smaller than normal, but still flowed, enough for the regime to maintain its machinery. Now that valve has been completely closed at the boundary between the Gulf of Oman and the Arabian Sea, and Kepler confirms that not a single ship has gotten through. The information valve. In previous crises, the regime controlled the internet in drips, slow enough that people could not organize effectively, but not to the point of shutting it down completely and self-destroying the digital economy. Now the regime has been forced to choose one or the other, and they chose to shut it down completely, accepting the trade-off of 2 million jobs in exchange for preventing organized protests. The military valve. Missiles and drones used to be Iran's strongest deterrent leverage, something that made any adversary think twice before acting. Rubio confirmed what analysts have been tracking. Iran now has only about half of its missiles left, no more production plants, no more navy. That leverage is not gone, but it is depleting at a rate that cannot be replenished. The proxy valve, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, the militia network in Iraq, Iran's extended arms in the region that once created dispersed pressure, forcing adversaries to deal with multiple fronts at once. All of them have been severely weakened in recent years. 4 valves, all closed at the same time. And this is what I want you to truly understand about the meaning of that, because it is not adding 4 crises together to get a crisis 4 times larger. When all the pressure release valves close simultaneously, you do not have a larger crisis in degree. You have a crisis different in nature. Each valve once allowed the regime to handle pressure in one way or another. Now there is no valve left to divert the pressure. All of that pressure accumulates in a single system with no escape. Rubio said one sentence at the end of the interview that I think summarizes Washington's entire strategic calculation. I hope that in the aftermath of this conflict, the whole world's eyes have been opened to the threat Iran poses. This is not just a war with Iran. This is a lesson that America wants to teach the whole world, about the price of building a secret nuclear program, about the price of sponsoring proxies across the region, about the price of turning an international commercial strait into a political weapon. And what happens next with Iran will be the example that Washington cites for decades to come. So what can really happen? There are 3 scenarios being considered. The first scenario, Iran accepts nuclear negotiations as a precondition, in reality, not as a delaying tactic. This is the scenario Washington wants, but its probability depends entirely on one question that even Rubio admits has no answer yet. Who is really making decisions in Tehran right now? The second scenario, the regime collapses from within before any deal is reached, not because of American bombs, not because of the naval blockade, but because internal conflicts and economic exhaustion push the Iranian people into the streets before the regime finds an exit. January 2026 already showed that the gap was only a few days, and the current conditions are significantly worse than January. The third scenario, Iran signs a deal sufficient to lift the blockade, but does not resolve the root nuclear issue, buys more time, temporary economic stabilization, and then the cycle begins again. This is exactly the scenario Rubio is implicitly warning about when he says more can be brought to bear, that if Iran thinks a temporary deal will end the pressure, they are miscalculating. This is what we are really witnessing. A regime being squeezed by three pressures at the same time: economic blockade strangling its lifelines, internal chaos paralyzing its ability to make decisions, and diplomatic isolation closing off every escape route one by one. Not one of the three. All three at once. And there is no valve left to release the pressure. But what is more important than what is happening to Iran is what Washington wants the whole world to learn from what is happening to Iran. Rubio made it clear. He hopes that after this conflict, the whole world will open its eyes to the threat that Iran poses. This is not a bilateral conflict between the United States and Iran. This is a lesson designed so that any nation watching, any government calculating whether it should follow the path Iran has taken, will look at it and clearly understand the price to be paid. The price of a secret nuclear program, the price of a network of proxies across the region, the price of turning an international commercial strait into a political weapon. But the real question, the question that no one in Washington or Tehran can answer right now, is not what will happen in the negotiating room. It is what will happen when 90 million Iranians are reconnected to the world. Whether the internet is restored because of a deal, because the regime collapses, or for any other reason, the first hours after reconnection could be the most important event of this entire crisis. Not the meeting in St. Petersburg, not the proposal from Pakistan, but 90 million Iranians, when they see each other, when they see the world, and when they decide what to do next. That is the variable that no strategic model can predict. I am Ryan Mitchell. If you want to keep following every development of this crisis, the real analysis behind the headlines, please subscribe to the channel. We will continue to update as the situation develops.